When you think of the very first video game, what comes to mind? For me, I think of Pong, which came out in 1972. In reality, there was a video game made in 1947, approximately 25 years before that, called the cathode ray tube amusement device. This is according to Mark Wolf in his book, Before the Crash, Early Video Game History. Although this game was made and was patented, it was never released. The video game Pong, which was released in 1972, was one of the very first video games ever released. From 1972 until 1982, lots of arcade games were released, including Breakout, Space Invaders, and Galaxian, just to name a few. Around the end of 1982, what is now referred to as the video game crash began. This video game crash conclusively ended in 1985 with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. The NES, which is my personal favorite console of all time, had its peak popularity in America from 1987 until the early 1990s. Sonic the Hedgehog was released in 1991 for the Sega Genesis and became the rival for NES's Mario franchise, starting the so-called console war. Some in-home video game systems started to become more controversial because of their violent nature, with games like Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and Doom being released. Co-op games don't usually enjoy very long lives, with popular titles rarely surviving more than a year, according to Rayford Goins in his book, Game After, A Cultural Study of Video Game Afterlife. Now, let's learn more about the cathode ray tube amusement device. This is the cathode ray tube amusement device and was technically an interactive electronic video game made in 1947 by Thomas Goldsmith and Essel Mann, a pair of physicists who worked at television designer Dumont Laboratories. Based on World War II radar displays, knobs were used to adjust the trajectory of light beams or missiles trying to hit targets printed on clear overlays, according to D.S. Cohen in his web article, Cathode Ray Tube Amusement Device, the first electronic game. There has been a lot of debate as to whether this was an actual video game or not, which I believe from my extensive research that it is. It received a U.S. patent in December 1948, but was never commercially manufactured or released. About 25 years passed, and a video game that many of us have heard of by the name of Pong was released and became the first big video game hit. Pong is a table tennis sports game featuring two simple dimensional graphics manufactured by Atari. This set in motion a lot of other video games that use design variations of this game to make other similar games such as Breakout, Space Invaders, and Galaxian. Companies would use Pong as a platform and make small changes and variations and make many different video games that became popular in the years following the release of Pong. An example of this would be by replacing a paddle in Pong with a grid of bricks and turning the screen. Here you have the game Breakout, which was released in 1976. Another example would be by having the bricks become a grid of aliens that can shoot at you, and there you have Space Invaders. With games being made pretty regularly by this point, we get into what is referred to as the video game crash, which began in late 1982. With the peak of arcade numbers at 10,000 nationwide in early 1982, 2,000 of those will be closed by the end of 1982. Oversaturation and cheap video games were a major contributor to this crash. Bowling alleys, along with variety stores and shopping malls, helped to save arcades, according to Nadia Oxford in her article, 10 Facts About the Video Game Crash of '83. The crash officially ended in 1985 with the release of NES in the US, according to Mark Wolf in his book, Video Games Around the World. The NES kept the light tower watch when third-party developers said the content they made for this system met their standards and kept their reputation well regarded. The NES was most popular between 1987 and the early 1990s when I was a little boy. Genesis does when Nintendo don't was a slogan created by Sega Genesis in 1990 and put into a TV advertisement taking a shot at Nintendo. They wanted to come out with an iconic character that would compete with Mario of Nintendo. As you can see, Nintendo had a huge sales gap over Sega in 1991, but by 1993, Sega had more cumulative sales a short time after and was the sales winner in the US. The release of Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991 started a huge rival between NES and Sega Genesis consoles throughout the 1990s. Of the two, Mario and Sonic, my choice for the better video game franchise has always been the Mario franchise, with some of their games being some of my personal favorites. Video games in the early 1990s started to become more violent and have more mature content. Games like Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and Doom were a new generation of violence in video games. This was very controversial for some people and led to the formation of the Interactive Digital Software Association and their rating games by assigning them their ESRB ratings since 1994. ESRB meaning Entertainment Software Rating Board. I remember many nights staying up as a young child with my brother playing these types of video games, and definitely my mother would not have approved of that. Co-op arcade games don't usually stay popular or last very long in arcades. When their time is up at the arcade, they are either sent out to warehouses for resale to clubs, resorts, or sometimes private collectors. They can be given another go-around, which in arcade terms is called being reincarnated. The last thing they usually do with them is being repurposed for use, with the innards being replaced with new video games. When thinking about video games, it's hard to imagine that it started way back in 1947. Video games have had a very large role in my life, and I am sure that most people have played them at least a few times in their lives. Video games have come a very long way since the cathode ray tube and Pong, and to this day are getting more and more advanced. As video game designer Shigeru Morimoto once said, "Video games are bad for you? That's what they said about rock and roll."
Yes, very good. You nailed it on